Okay, everybody. We're going to be covering the TREC contract changes. Remember, we posted a little over a week ago the TAR changes for the listing agreement and the seller's disclosure. So, this is for you guys to go over, review, see what's happening with the TREC side, which affects obviously the contract, as we've already talked about. It's going to be covering other addendum, and it's going to be having a new disclosure. So, I'm going to document this for those that weren't able to make the sales meeting or the other training, okay, that we scheduled for this. First off, these changes are going live July 1st, so they're coming up very quickly. And again, if you have a seller's disclosure on your listing and that seller's disclosure is the older one and you are not under contract, you need to update to a new the new seller's disclosure, which is already inside of dotloop for our agents. Okay, let's go have some fun here. Let's start up on our contract. Okay, so we're gonna make this a little bit larger here for you guys. Even though this is the new date, you need to look in the top right so you can identify what's the correct document to use. If it says 2026 up there, you're using the correct version. Okay, moving downwards, they've added generators. It was already technically was an improvement, but they've clarified in here as an improvement because it's attached to the property. Can't just be picked up and moved. Let's go through here. They've done some changes in how they use the phrase option fee. Not a big deal, not consequential. Now the consequential thing in here is the change for if the date that the earnest money or option money is to be received falls on a Texas holiday, a legal holiday in Texas, and you can review those. Section 662.003, there's a whole list of them, and I'll probably post up this list too. Be aware if it falls on those days, it'll go to the next business day. And there are some unusual ones in there, so please keep an eye on that. So that means if you're going under contract and you want to make sure you get things in on the correct time, or you might want to see if you have extra time, well, there you go. So moving down on here, let's go to the next major change. Seller's disclosure, name changes too on the contract. Here we go. Texas groundwater and surface water rights. So we've done a whole video that was a pretty deep look into groundwater and surface water rights. Now, the deal with this, guys, is if your property has, and you need to look down here, if your property is essentially just on city water, and it's just in a tract subdivision, it's most likely you're not going to have to use this new disclosure, okay? And we'll take a look at it here. I think I have it right over here. So here's that disclosure. What you have in here is it functions similarly to the seller's disclosure, where if you choose not to provide this and it needs to be provided, once you provide the disclosure to someone upon going under contract, you'll have 7 days to terminate, just like with the seller's disclosure in the contract, how it's already functioning. What are the exceptions for this? Let's get into this and kind of be a little more detailed. Seller's not aware of a water well on the property in use or not in use. So guys, you're going to need the disclosure if there's a well on the property, regardless if it's in use or not. So like there's certain areas of San Antonio where like used to have a well, but you switch to city water. Well, if they're aware of the well being on the property, you're going to have to then utilize the disclosure, okay? Pond, lake, or water tank on the property. So, even if you're on city water, but you have, a small pond on the property or water tank, you're going to need to utilize this disclosure. Certificate of education, I'm not going to get into that. That's not going to really be applicable for most of us. Seller's not aware of any groundwater rights that have been severed from the property. So that's an interesting one too. So there can be a case where, I guess technically in a subdivision, new developments, you might have the groundwater rights stripped away from that, and that would be interesting. So if you're aware of that, you need to utilize the disclosure. Not common. So essentially what this is like, this is a disclosure, just so we can look at this real quick in the context of that section of the contract. You have groundwater district. Groundwater is your water that is used for wells. It's underground water. Think of it as that, okay? It's talking about what that means. Surface water is, in Texas, we don't really have any surface water rights. We don't have that. We have exceptions for use and on there for surface water, but that's not owned by anybody, not by us. So surface water, It describes that, surface water rights. You have to have a permit to deal with it, but that's beyond what we're doing today. Water wells. It's a pretty simple disclosure that you have on there as any portion in a groundwater district. So once you actually have one of those items on the property, you have to go through this and fill this out, okay? So I don't want to make a big deal about this. If you're really curious about it, we can go through it in more depth, but reach out if you have any questions on it, okay? But basically, you're going to have to fill that, your seller is going to have to fill out that disclosure. Okay, let's move downward here. And so this is functionally going to be one of the larger areas for change, which is they have moved the section that is dealing with the settlement and other expenses. Okay, that's been moved for our commission. They've stripped out this horrible language on here that was very confusing in how we deal with the commission, and they've moved it here and made a whole section. So instead of the confusing language, seller will pay 3% of sales price to be applied towards broker compensation owed by buyer to buyer's broker. Broker's compensation is not set by law. They have their disclosure. Contributions shall be applied, not change the party's obligations to pay compensation pursuant to those agreements. So if you have 0 in here, it's making it clear that if you have 3% in your buyer's rep, that buyer's still responsible for that 3% for the full amount. And then here's the interesting one is this one here is the buyer can actually make a contribution to the listing broker's commission on behalf of the seller. So someone we brought in the sales meeting, Farhad, when he buys investment properties, will pay all expenses and commissions. So very interesting to see that. Expense limitation, we have that here, buyer, applied to, okay, this is dealing with government loan programs where there's non-allowables. So like on VA loans, talks about the process for how that's going to be paid out first before other areas, before other items. There's the non-allowables on a VA loan. Not going to get into that, but in a lot of detail, but now that's being clarified in here even more. Attorney's fees, they just renaming, they're going from listing broker to seller's broker. Okay. Other broker to buyer's broker. I think that's good that they're using that naming policy from now on. Seller and buyer to properly execute and deliver any statements, documents, and information requested by escrow agent requiring governmental reporting requirements. Okay. So when you have transactions with an LLC or an entity, you are now going to be required to fill out some paperwork and disclosures and some items for that at title. And so that's now saying in the contract, you have to do that. That's not an option. And that's to alleviate some of the problems they've had where people were refusing to do that. Buyer's agent notices, this has been cleaned up a little bit. Buyer's agent, pretty simple. Third-party financing and agreement of parties has been cleaned up too and actually organized a bit. So that's nice. I like that. And let's go down to the broker contact information. The biggest thing, okay, I need you guys to pay attention on this. The biggest change on this is intermediary now has been brought to its own spot. Thank you, God, for doing that. Oh man, I'm so happy. That makes it easier. But the phone number of licensed supervisor, please don't put my cell phone number, guys. Please put the 210-493-1766 in there, okay? All right, that's the old one. And there's no more information about commission in here, information on here. Not this little section that's caused us so many problems over the years is gone from the contract forever. Thank heaven. So all right, that's it on the contract. Let's move to the next one. HOA addendum. Okay. So not big changes in the HOA addendum, but let's read through this here. Buyer shall obtain, you're going to get, it's really dealing with the buyer section in here. And I'm going to just summarize this. This date that you put in here, okay, whatever hits earlier is the kicking point for the 3 days to terminate upon the receipt of subdivision information. Okay, so if you read this, buyer is deemed to receive the subdivision information on the date of actual receipt or the date specified in this paragraph, whichever earlier. So they can't sit there, the buyer. The point in this is if you put 10 days and the buyer, it's their duty per the contract to obtain that information. Essentially, that 3 days to terminate kicks in at day 10. Okay. And even if they receive the subdivision information on day 21 because they ordered it late or they had some trouble in ordering it, and basically that's putting a cap for how long they can terminate on that. I actually like that. In fact, that's an interesting way to limit their ability to exit the contract is if you put that very early, let's say you have a 10-day option period, and you put that on day 7. I like this strategy. You put that on day 7 for the buyer to obtain that information, and then maybe the seller says, okay, you get the subdivision information, we will get the pay for the transfer fee. And that's kind of a reversal of what people have historically done. And that would eliminate having an out far into the contract, just an exit, just this open exit, 20 days in, which I think is an interesting strategy. Obviously, there's some challenges sometimes with getting the buyer to order it, but I mean, the buyer just asks title to order it on their behalf, just like the seller usually does. And now you're in a position where the buyer has a cap on their out, a much easier cap on their out without having to do anything for the seller having to deliver it early or be responsible for pulling that information. Down here, transfer fee, same stuff that we're dealing with here, transfer fees and such, putting the cap, buyer will pay up to that amount. All right. The amendment on here, take a look. It's changed a little bit. They changed their phrasing, and then they also changed the compensation amount here for commissions. They've put they followed the same method that they have on the new contract for dealing with it. So that should look familiar. And then let's look up the addendum for backup contract. Had some changes. Basically, what it's saying, and this is a very small detail, and I know this is not it's not obscure, but it's not a commonly used form. And it basically, your new execution date is not when the buyer the effective date, for purposes of performance, the effective date of the backup contract changes to the date the seller delivers the notice of termination of the first contract to buyer. Okay, so basically what this is saying is, instead of the buyer receives the notice, it's when the seller gives the notice to that original buyer. The seller delivers the notice of termination to buyer, our buyer. The delivery date, okay, is the new effective date. Okay, so you give it to their agent, the buyer's agent, and that's been now, the seller has now effectively delivered that. So the new effective date is that date, the notice of buyer's termination to the first contract. Okay. Anyways, be aware of that. And I think that's it, guys. I mean, we've gone through this. If you have any more questions, please ask. I know there's some other minor changes, like they followed that landscape of changes with other contracts, but I wanted to cover the big ones. Just to summarize, this is live on the first, guys. You can be using these forms now. I think we've already had them all updated in .loop, so be aware of that. And we'll go from there. Okay? Hey, y'all have a great week, and I'll see you.